The wonders of technology, thank you. It's a real honor to be here. I know that the Ebert Foundation has really had a lot of intellectual leadership, and I'm just going to dive in because there's just so much to discuss tonight. So my main theme tonight is, if we want to understand where digital capitalism is taking us, we should look at some of the words of the chief digital capitalists themselves and try to understand from their own visions what vision they have in store for us. And the idea that I believe is really key here is that it's a vision that goes beyond sort of being part of a market to governing markets. And I'll start with a controversy that was pretty big in the US, probably didn't make waves here, but it was that tech often will take on the state. So in the US, the Airbnb chief executive, he was in a number of disputes with different cities about reporting about the impact of Airbnb on the availability of housing. And when he was regulated, he said, well, we're not going to obey certain regulations, and we really are like Gandhi, resisting British rule. Okay? Another tech leader compared themselves, Uber, to the civil rights leader Rosa Parks. And they later apologized for this, but I think it opens up a very interesting conversation, which is on the politics of platforms. If you believe sort of a conventional view within the leadership of digital capitalism itself, it is that platforms promote a lot fairer labor markets by enabling lower cost entry. And the idea is that the large digital platforms are there because they are the best at what they do. But what I tried to do in a recent article called Two Narratives of Platform Capitalism is to discuss a counter-narrative, which first starts by focusing on the ways in which platforms can make workers' lives more precarious, and second, tries to challenge the foundations of why certain companies win. Certainly, we have to respect the hard work and intelligence of the coders and managers and financiers at the top of many of the leading enterprises here. But we also have to acknowledge that luck, first mover advantages, lobbying, other factors played a role. And because of those other factors, that's why it's so important that we have the conversation we're having today. Otherwise, we're left with a bit of a pincer movement, and the pincer movement is this, that there's often public cooperation between technology firms and the government in the forms of supplying assistance, be it technical on artificial intelligence, big data, et cetera, and supplying other forms of expertise. But simultaneously, there's often a private rivalry lobbying to change or limit the goals of government. The Google Transparency Project has discussed this a bit. I've got an example on the slide of Uber after there were some proposals to regulate it in New York, telling every rider that essentially these proposals would lead to massive increases in the amount of time they would have to wait for a cab. Of course, the decision is never that simple a binary, right? It's not that the moment you regulate, suddenly you kill the golden goose of innovation. That's a fairy tale. Instead, we've got to talk about the subtleties here. And that's what this pincer movement is really preventing. Now, the revolving door and the efforts within companies to influence or be part of government, that's old. But what's new in digital capitalism, I think, are two fundamental dynamics. The first is the shift from many firms from being a market participant to a market governor. Firms like, say, the large digital platforms in housing, among ride sharing, online for digital books, music, other areas, they aim to really govern those markets. They're no longer participants in them in a real respect. They're governing them because of lock-in effects and monopolization and other effects like that. That moves from a logic of territorial to functional governments. And all I mean by that is that in a territorially governed state, you would have the city council or the Länder or other intermediary authorities or the national government making rules about the nature of, say, ride-sharing agreements, tenancies, how information is shared online or can be copied or not copied, et cetera. But you now have companies large enough where they are essentially the functional governors. They govern those functions. And in recharacterizing this, I take inspiration from the great legal realist Robert Lee Hale, who says there's government whenever one person or group can tell others what they should do. Now, how far could this governance go? Oops, sorry. And this is a rather, unusual fable, but I want to share it because I think it really gives an insight. There's a guy named Max Tegmark who's a member of many important groups in the US about thinking about the future of artificial intelligence. And he offers a version of what I call social science fiction in this book recently released called Life 3.0. The idea is that eventually large tech companies will get so savvy at understanding and manipulating the public sphere that it won't be enough merely to provide lobbyists or to provide people within government, but that they will essentially be sponsoring secret news channels that cater to different factions that push an agenda of tax cutting and entitlement cutting and social services cutting, which is then made up by idealistic companies. Okay? So, and again, I call it a fable, a fantasy, a fiction, but it's a vision, and it's a vision of the traditional political left dying off as large tech firms take its place. Okay? Now, the question becomes, how is this takeover going so far, right? If that's what's supposed to be the dynamic. Well, we all followed this week the calling before Congress of Facebook, Google, and Twitter. I mean, this was a huge controversy in the US. And I imagine worldwide there's been some attention to this sudden call for accountability among dominant intermediaries. But I, in my work, focus on things that are, right now I'm focusing on things that are much more quotidian and much more in the grain of the small effects that these large firms can have on smaller businesses. So there was one expose this week about opioid rehab centers, drug rehab centers in the US. And what this story revealed, it was in a magazine called The Verge by journalist Kat Ferguson, was that there is this war going on among rehab centers. Some of them are extremely disreputable. They don't really help the people they're supposed to help. Others are extremely reputable. And the disreputable ones hire people to manipulate Google. They buy lots of ads. They will go online to so-called volunteer services, and then they will switch the phone number out of their rivals and put in a different phone number. When they do things like this, then the reputable companies say, oh my goodness, I've got to buy more Google ads because the organic content is being manipulated, okay? So this is a way in which chaos in the market for these centers leads to profits for people in charge of the ostensible management of these centers. If they want to be the governors of capitalism, they're not doing a very good job. Of course, we've all seen this also with the predictable consequences of the automated public sphere. I gave a talk at Republica back in May here about the automated public sphere. It's coming out in German in a few weeks. And in this talk, I just talked about things that we're all seeing now splashed all over the front pages of the papers. About things like disreputable news sites going viral on Facebook, saying things like, because of Obama, everyone in America has to be implanted with a microchip on their shoulder. That Hillary is still out killing people even after the election. I mean, this is the sort of things that still are being spread. And there was a very alarming picture that I blacked out because it showed what it would be like to get an Obama microchip. But of course, that picture gets past Facebook because it's automated, right? Or it's ostensibly digitally managed, but it's not managed by anything. It's chaos. This accompanies, of course, the revenue shift that Yulia brought up, right, that we're all familiar with in terms of, this is from the US, but there's a similar story playing out in many, many places around the world. And this sort of disruption of journalism in turn leads lots of journalists to buy into what I call premature disruption hype. So for example, even the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, recently was reporting that chatbots would replace lawyers. That instead of having to go to a lawyer and file a lawsuit, you could just download an app and say, I've got a problem with this company, Equifax. Can you sue them for me? Oh, sure, just fill out the form. Okay. Of course, this is completely overblown. It's ridiculous. I mean, and then immediately, other journalistic channels, and by the way, this was from TechCrunch, an entity that has a very big interest in understanding what's hype and what's not, right? They come out and say, no, you can't use a chatbot to be your lawyer, right? And the problem, though, is I think that we have just too much of a narrative of automation hype. And we have to separate the fact from fiction, because if we don't, we're going to be luring unsuspecting consumers into bad services, and we're going to be distorting the ways in which we consider how our technological future should unfold. I think that this automation overreach is what creates the anxieties over artificial intelligence now. Essentially what's going on is we're too often trying to govern the computational manipulation of the natural world and the human world with the same rules. And when we do that, we give certain advantages to companies that say, set up arms races. Like, for example, I would say Google, with respect to those rehab centers, was setting up an arms race. Who can manipulate the results best? That's problematic. In finance and the military, too. We also see that this opens the door to a deflationary dynamic. And what I mean by that is that as services are automated, the displaced workers' purchasing power declines. And as that purchasing power declines, it leads to more demand for worse automated services. Of course, if you've lost your job, then maybe a chatbot lawyer is all that you can afford, right? And that's one of the reasons why, in preparing for this conference and reading the Industry 4.0 literature and the green paper and the white paper and some of the work that Andrea Nylund has contributed to, I was so impressed by the slogans such as better, not cheaper, right? Or better and cheaper, or, but at least better, right? That we're not just trying to make things cheaper, but we're also trying to include individuals in their creation and make them better. My broad policy goals out of the work that I've been doing about automation would encourage more investment in automation toward things like clean energy, drug development, manufacturing and innovation. Things like what Herr Kagerman has been working on and others have been working on here in terms of the Industry 4.0 framework. But I want to see much better regulation of the automation of culture, of journalism, of political advertising, of education, even of mental health. In the US now, there's a lot of buzz around a company called Woebot, W-O-E for sadness, that apparently is supposed to be your chatbot aid to help you out of depression. And I don't doubt it will help some people, but I also don't doubt that it will be used to justify cutting funds to mental health care and other things if we don't try to sequence and pace this type of automation in a responsible way. The ultimate tension, I think, in automation policy right now is between a push to make services cheaper by automating them, services such as education, healthcare, others, and the concern that automation is killing jobs. And I think we've got to balance those things. And I think the way that we do is by introducing an old concept called the paradox of thrift. And in the 1930s, the John Maynard Keynes had a great concept about the problems that could arise if one individual's saving is rational, and yet as a collective, it's irrational, right? Because one individual may decide, I'm not going to spend money on all these different things, and they save money, but then they may find that they live in a community where what they didn't spend has led to the economic downturns for their neighbors, and then their neighbors can't spend on what they have to offer. And I think this paradox of thrift we have to connect to a literature on something called the cost disease in services, complaints from economists that services are getting too expensive. I question this cost disease, okay? And I think that there's a nuanced view of cost. The economist behind the cost disease was someone named William Baumol, and he was originally very worried about the fact that education, healthcare, human services in general could take up more and more of an economy, and that could slow it down. And I see this talk of the OECD and many other influential policy centers. But Baumol himself said that the larger threat was cheapening of technologies that generated pollution and destruction. And I'd say many of the automated technologies I brought up in the first half of my talk fit into those categories. He believed, and I think that you can take these, he believed that assuming reasonable growth rates, even continual rises in GDP share taken by so-called stagnant sectors, service sectors, could lead to growth for everyone. And I would take these points further and say that premature automation of human services could easily promote a downward spiral in economic activity that we should seek to avoid. And I just give one sort of, I know this chart may be a little hard to read, but the idea behind it is relatively straightforward. And it is that if you assume a certain level of growth in GDP, even if you have a certain level of growth in services, you still end up with more disposable income for everyone, even after they've spent on healthcare or other services. And I think we need to bear that in mind as we face what I think is a false dichotomy of either slow and responsible innovation and automation or fast and growth-producing automation. The unsavory alternative is that we end up with one profession ruling them all. And the technical argument that all work is reproducible to data patterns, that machines can reproduce, I think that's ultimately a political argument, right? And it's a political argument for the power of a couple of sectors, tech and the finance that allows it to gain a lot of its power, over all others. And we've had an alternative vision. That was in the Works Progress Administration, which is illustrated above. Many groups are advancing an alternative vision. And so I think that ultimately the robot question is a matter of political economy and social theory. It's what this conference is all about. It's what has been brought together some of the best minds in the world on these issues. And I really look forward to all of the panels tomorrow. And I think we'll be asking questions like, do we invest in human expertise or just replace it? Do we see wages as a mere cost or as a stable claim to resources and respect? And when we do that, how we find out that there are ways that it is possible to govern digital capitalism rather than being governed by it. Thank you.